You don't have to be very wealthy and living a lavish lifestyle to need to think about inheritance tax.
We couldn't have a conversation about the budget and changes to inheritance tax without talking about tractors and farmers, I don't think.
If you were worth £900,000, exclusive of your pensions, no tax would be payable.
Provided I haven't given £600,000 away, by the way, a year before I've died.
I think one of the headlines that's come from the budget is the impact that the changes will have on business owners.
Planning is what's crucial, isn't it? Hello. Today I'm going to be talking about inheritance tax, specifically after the budget that took place around 5 weeks ago now. Some of the changes, we're not quite sure how they're going to pan out, but fortunately I'm joined by my expert colleague, Caroline Woodham, who specialises in both inheritance tax planning and resolving inheritance tax issues when someone has died. Is that right?
Absolutely. So I deal with both pre-death planning, lifetime planning, and also the administration of estates after somebody has passed away. So we look at it from both sides.
Yes, and I know that there was a lot of speculation before the budget, and then immediately we heard the detail of it. We thought, well, a lot hasn't changed, but then in the detail there were some significant changes. So should we just start by you talking us through those, if you could, Caroline?
Of course. So the areas that we were looking at in terms of change were actually quite broad. And one of the areas that was of particular interest to me is whether the tax allowances would change. The normal nil-rate bands, the tax allowance that estates have when somebody dies, and the residence nil-rate bands, which came into force a few years ago now, but could have been subject to change. But both your nil-rate band and your residence nil-rate band rules have stayed as they were. That's advantageous because we know what we're doing with those rules, and it's very clear for everybody who is estate planning what those rules are and how they apply to them. What we haven't seen is any change to the tax brackets as things get more expensive. So as
in real terms,
as house prices increase, the wealth of individuals increases over time with wage rises, savings increases, etc. We are still with a nil-rate band of £325,000, which it has been for quite a number of years now.
Now, you and I our office is based in the southeast of England, and most people who own a property in this part of the world would be probably captured within that £325,000 band. So this is relevant to everybody in quite a large part of the country, isn't it?
That's right. We are living in an area where house prices are higher than average, and it means for somebody who would consider themselves to have quite a modest amount of money, their house, some money in the bank in savings, and maybe some basic investments, actually, because of significant house prices in this area, they could find themselves subject to inheritance tax just because the asset they live in is worth a lot of money. They wouldn't have access to money beyond anybody else from a kind of cash flow point of view. And it's also something
that people really do want to pass on if they possibly can.
Absolutely.
So that's sort of good news, but it's relative good news, I guess, is what you're saying. What about the real big changes that were introduced? Were there any that I think there were?
There were, yes. So the biggest change that will affect the majority of our clients, or at least become something the majority of our clients need to think about, are the changes to the pension rules.
Yes.
They are quite a considerable shift. There's been quite a considerable shift in the pension rules compared to where we would have been before the budget. We don't yet know the full extent of those changes. We're in the middle of a consultation period now that will finalise in January next year. And then we expect there will be the requirement for the law to change, the legislation, so where the law is written by Parliament, changes there that will give us more details about the pensions changes before we see those changes come into force, not until 2027.
But am I right in understanding that a lot of people have used their pension pot as a form of inheritance tax planning, and therefore they will probably immediately start thinking differently about where they're putting their money in anticipation of when they die?
Yes, I think that is the case. For a lot of people, either pension planning and inheritance planning have gone hand in hand, or you haven't had to think too hard about inheritance tax because any wealth within your pension has fallen outside of that and it keeps you below the tax allowances. Generally, as a society, we're encouraged to save for our retirement. Pensions are available through our employers, private pensions are available, and those pensions come in different forms. But the majority of adults will have a pension of some form or another. And they have previously been quite useful inheritance tax planning vehicles. Having pensions bought into an inheritance tax calculation for the majority of people and the majority of pensions will be a change from the current situation, and it will mean more people find their estates taxable upon their death, and more so than that, some people will end up being quite wealthy on their death because of their pensions, which leads to more complicated tax planning concerns.
Yes, so just to try and unravel that a little bit, the current situation is I die, I perhaps own a property, I perhaps have some savings in the bank, and perhaps my estate is worth £900,000, and if I'm benefiting from all those spousal reliefs and transferable residential band, I might be lucky enough, or my family might be lucky enough, not to have any tax burden at all.
You're
Yes?
absolutely correct. So for a married individual with children, married couple with children, between you have around £1 million of tax relief available on death. The details are more complicated than that, but the £1 million for a married person with children is the sort of figure we'd be talking around. So if you were worth £900,000, exclusive of your pensions, no tax would be payable.
Provided I haven't given £600,000 away, by the way, a year before I've died or something
Provided
like that.
that there are no gifts that we need to think about or anything else more complicated going on, it would be the case that your pension passed under the pension rules, which commonly would be without any inheritance tax payable. Your estate passed under your will. Within your inheritance tax allowances, there's no inheritance tax to pay. These rules would change that.
And so, of course, if we're dealing with an estate, which I know you deal with frequently, the executor has that responsibility of declaring the assets. And if they're under £1 million and all the allowances are available, happy days to an extent, apart from somebody's died. But now, if there's a pension pot added in, a few £100,000 in it, which they commonly are, dependent whether they've been used very much or not, you could be tipping over that. And then it's the executor's responsibility, of course, isn't it, to...
Well, it might not actually be the case.
Okay.
One of the potential changes is that your pension provider would be responsible for declaring and settling any inheritance tax that is attracted by your pension, and your estate, your personal representatives of your estate, would be responsible for dealing with the inheritance tax in relation to those assets. So rather than at the moment, which is a fairly singular system, you have your personal representatives. If in the less common instance, your pension does form part of your estate, the money goes from the pension company to your executors or administrators and out to your beneficiaries, having been dealt with from a tax point of view by your administrators. The changes seem to suggest that your pension company will be responsible for any tax on the pension side, your executors on the estate side, and those two individuals will need to work quite closely together to make sure everybody has the right information to be declaring and paying the tax appropriately.
I think something that's very clear to me is that every situation could be quite different to the other, and people will really need to be exploring what this means for them personally, as opposed to a broad brush approach, which is perhaps a little bit more what we've got at the moment.
Yes, I think that would have to be the case. So for every individual, it will now be a case of establishing what's happening in your estate, what's happening in your pension, how they relate to each other, and that would be your starting point. Whereas for most individuals now, we as lawyers assisting executors and administrators would be focusing largely on the estate side of things. We'd talk to pension providers, we'd make sure we have sufficient information to be doing our job correctly, but the intricacies are less problematic. But there is the chance that that relationship would have to be much closer. And also there will be a time pressure, which we already have, but that time pressure will feel more acute, I would think, with that extra layer of communication that's needed, because inheritance tax should be paid in part or in full, depending on your circumstances, within 6 months of you passing away.
Otherwise, interest, penalties,
Absolutely.
etc. Yes. And another thing that is an impact, I understand, is that currently we talk about the £1 million threshold. But of course, if your estate is worth over £2 million, you lose that £1 million threshold, don't you? It drops down. And that's a bit of a trip spot, as I understand it.
Absolutely correct. And it applies to your residence nil rate band. So the additional tax allowance that you can claim if you are passing your home, your residential property, to something called your lineal descendants. So a child or children, grandchildren, etc. At the moment, that tax allowance will be claimable in full as long as you meet the requirements and the total value of your estate is less than £2 million. That in itself doesn't change, but if we are adding the value of your pension to the value of your assets, suddenly your estate might be worth more than £2 million in a way that it wouldn't have been prior to the changes.
Exactly, yeah. So lots of people swanning along thinking I'm quite well organised are now going to have to reorganise themselves, really. And I think that's the big lesson. So I think we couldn't have a conversation about the budget and changes to inheritance tax without talking about tractors and farmers, I don't think. And that's not in any way to diminish the impact that aspect of the budget had. But can you just touch on that for me a bit?
Yes. So I think one of the headlines that's come from the budget is the impact that the changes will have on business owners and people within the agricultural industry, particularly those who own farms, farming land, etc. There are and have been, up until these changes, some quite generous tax reliefs on business assets and agricultural assets. They're called business property relief and agricultural property relief. Yeah. And for qualifying assets, you can reduce their value by 100% for the purpose of your inheritance tax calculation. So businesses and farms can be passed on to your chosen beneficiaries without having a significant tax burden attached to them. There has now, within the budget, been a cap introduced on the availability of agricultural property relief. So you would be able to claim the 100% relief on agricultural property or business property up to the first £1 million, and then it would only be a 50% relief on the assets over that value, which means you end up paying a notional rate of around 20% of tax on those assets over the first £1 million.
Yes, quite complicated and quite niche, but relevant obviously to anybody who's banking upon passing on a working farm and agricultural land to their heirs.
And one of the complications often with business or agricultural interests is that they tend to be asset heavy, capital heavy and cash poor, or they can be, which means liquidating sufficient interest to pay the tax is a complicating factor.
Complicated, yes. And I suppose this comes back to the fact that planning is what's crucial, isn't it? Whether there's other ways to mitigate potential inheritance tax in the future. There are all sorts of ways that you can mitigate and not avoid, I suppose is what I'm trying to say, because we're not, but it's about understanding the rules and then having the paper trail to show that you have done it honestly and in the correct way that's allowed to be done.
Exactly that. I think I've been a strong advocate for planning properly for the future and for your death for quite a long time. It goes with the territory in my job, but those requirements feel more acute now that for a lot of individuals, the taxable nature of their estate may become much more realistic prospect, both in terms of properly planning what to do with pensions, with any business or farming interests. And I think information is key. If you understand what your exposure is, you can establish whether you need to think more about it or not. And if you do, you can start to work with the right professionals to develop a plan.
That a plan is what's important. And there's a lot said about the small percentage of people whose estates would be subject to inheritance tax, but actually that's a growing number of people now, given the rise in property prices and investments and the pension pots being dragged into that value of yourself when you pass away.
Already I deal with very ordinary people who have had ordinary jobs, ordinary lives, ordinary investments, and they live in their home and they don't do anything frivolous or fancy, but they are exposed to inheritance tax simply because of where they live or inherited assets that they've received themselves, various other factors. So you don't have to be very wealthy and living a lavish lifestyle to need to think about inheritance tax. I would say a large proportion of people I speak to would benefit from at least knowing where they stand.
Where they stand. And one thing to finish, if I may, every budget, for as long as I can remember, we've always wondered if they're going to do anything about deeds of variation.
Yeah.
Deeds of family arrangement, they're sometimes called, aren't they? And that's when people decide to vary the beneficiaries once someone has died, i.e. X is inheriting from a will, but instead it would be useful to jump through X and get to the next generation. Now, that's a clever bit of estate planning that's still available, isn't it?
Yes, so there haven't been any major changes to the rules in relation to deeds of variation. And therefore, if you're due to inherit from somebody after they've died, but that inheritance is going to make your own inheritance tax position more complicated, it would be possible to enter a variation within 2 years of them passing away. So you can redirect some or all of your inheritance away from your estate into the estates of the people you might want it to be received by ultimately. Yeah. And the other area where we didn't see any significant change was the gifting rules. It was something that was speculated prior to the budget, but the gifting rules remain as they were, and gifting can be quite a powerful tool to mitigate inheritance tax for the right person in the right circumstance with proper planning.
Provided you live for 7 years, of course. So don't do this at home. Don't vary a will without proper advice, please, because we don't want you to come back to us and say, you said you could do that, because there are special rules about the way you have to do it.
And we would always look at the individual circumstances in totality when giving that advice, because one of the disadvantages in giving is once you've gifted something away from yourself, you don't have access to it anymore. So if you're relying on that asset for an income or for your own future care, your own future planning, then it's not always a good idea. So proper advice, and sometimes that advice needs to be not just with a lawyer, but with your accountant or a financial advisor or other professionals who know what they're talking about and can work with you and your circumstances to formulate an outcome that makes sense for you.
So your Christmas reading, you're going to be reading on the consultation with regard to the pension.
Well, if it's out in time, I think it's due in January, so I might get a little reprieve over Christmas before the hard work starts again in the new year.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Caroline, for clarifying all those issues.
You're more than welcome.
Well, and raising awareness of them. Lovely to speak to you.
Thank you very much.